Today we're going to talk about the Congo Free State. This is a study in imperialism, specifically in imperialistic atrocities. So the background, let's talk about the imperialism that took place in Africa and what's called the Scramble for Africa, which is given the dates 1880 to 1914. So we're backtracking from World War I and going back to one of the major events that led to World War I and why so many countries were involved. So Africa before European domination, well, the Europeans had showed up in the 1450s. Portuguese began exploring the coast, but African armies were strong and they kept them out. By 1880, Europeans only controlled 10% of all African land, mostly ports on the coast. One of the reasons Europeans had difficulty navigating the interior of Africa, there were no maps. The jungle, the rivers, the deserts were very hard to navigate. Disease such as yellow fever, the one from mosquitoes, drawing a blank, we'll skip that one. Africans controlled their own trade networks and provided trade items as well. So they cooperated with Europeans, so there was no emphasis, catalyst for imperialism or colonial domination up until this point. So this is what it looks like in 1880. You can see the French have a very small empire. The Spanish have virtually no empire. The Portuguese actually have the largest influence from their colonial and mercantile history. And then the British have started to establish trading posts, especially in South Africa and along the west coast of Africa. Keep that in mind. Other things that kept Europeans out of Africa until the late 19th century: fear of black Africa, in quotes. It was called the Dark Continent. People didn't understand what was going on in Africa, and it built up prejudice about the African continent. Racial theories at the time as well contributed to this, especially social Darwinism. We've been reading about how the Europeans, many Europeans called them uncivilized, barbaric people without a civilization or culture of their own. Now when we say this, keep in mind, not everybody thought this. Many people did not believe this, but this became a prevalent idea that defined the age. Wrong. They couldn't have been more wrong. There were brilliant, thriving civilizations that existed in Africa, still exist today in Africa, but this was misunderstood. Tribes were very politically organized. One of the false ideas was that tribes had no political organizations, and therefore the Europeans, when they came in, should establish a political system. That's not true either at all. And to explain this in greater detail, here's John Green.
Hi, my name is John Green. This is Crash History, and today we're going to talk about Africa. Mr. Green, we've already talked about Africa. Egypt isn't Africa, and you haven't shut up about it the entire course. Yeah, that's true of me from the past, but Africa's big. It's like super big, much bigger than it appears on most maps, actually. I mean, you can fit India and China and the United States if you just folded in Maine. All of that fits in Africa. Like any huge place, Africa is incredibly diverse, and it's a mistake to focus just on Egypt. So today, let's go here, south of the Sahara Desert. First, let's turn to written records. Oh, right, we don't have very many, at least not written by sub-Saharan Africans. Much of African history was preserved via oral rather than written tradition. These days, we tend to think of writing as the most accurate and reliable form of description, but then again, we do live in a print-based culture, and we've already said that writing is one of the markers of civilization, implying that people who don't use writing aren't civilized, a prejudice that has been applied over and over again to Africa. But one, if you need evidence that it's possible to produce amazing literary artifacts without the benefit of writing, let me direct your attention to the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were composed and memorized by poets for centuries before anyone ever wrote them down. And two, no less an authority than Plato said that writing destroys human memory by alleviating the need to remember anything. And three, you think oral tradition is uncivilized, but here you are listening to me talk.
Three very good points. I agree with him, and I agree with Plato. We got to be careful that we don't rot our brains with words and reading.
We do have a lot of interesting records for some African histories, including the legendary tale of Mansa Musa. By legendary, I mean some of it probably isn't true, but it sure is important. Let's go to the book. So there was this king, Mansa Musa, who the West African Empire of Mali, and in 1324-ish, he left his home and made the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. He brought with him an entourage of over 1,000 people, some sources say 60,000, and most importantly, 100 camel loads of gold. I wish it had been donkeys so I could say he had 100 ass loads of gold, but no, camels, right. So along the way, Mansa Musa spent freely and gave away lots of his riches. Most famously, when he reached Alexandria, at the time one of the most cultured cities in the world, he spent so much gold that he caused runaway inflation throughout the city that took years to recover from. He built houses in Cairo and in Mecca to house his attendants, and as he traveled through the world, a lot of people, notably the merchants of Venice, no, like actual merchants of Venice, right? They saw him in Alexandria and returned to Italy with tales of Mansa Musa's ridiculous wealth, which helped create the myth in the minds of Europeans that West Africa was a land of gold, an El Dorado, the kind of place you'd like to visit, and maybe, you know, in 5 centuries or so, begin to pillage. Thanks. So what's so important about the story of Mansa Musa? Well, first, it tells us that there were African kingdoms ruled by fabulously wealthy African kings, which undermines one of the many stereotypes about Africa, that its people were poor and lived in tribes ruled by chiefs and witch doctors. Also, since Mansa Musa was making the Hajj, we know that he...
Okay, we're going to stop right there. One of the main points he's making is that Mansa Musa demonstrates that African cultures were rich, they were vibrant, and they existed for thousands of years before European contact, and they existed still when the Europeans came. The other thing he noted was in 5 centuries after Mansa Musa, maybe they would pillage and plunder, and that's what we're talking about today. How over time, Europeans threw these ideas aside of rich civilizations, allowed ideas of the time like social Darwinism to sink in and allow them to go into Africa and exploit. So up until 1860s, a few people said, I'm interested in Africa. Mainly missionaries, explorers, humanitarians, and people heard about Africa via books, newspapers, and exciting adventure stories. So only a select few people were heading into especially the interior of Africa. Enter David Livingstone. David Livingstone is one of the most famous Scottish missionaries of all time, arguably the most, but undoubtedly the most well-known. And we're going to talk about why. So David Livingstone is the man on the left with the good book, or maybe those are just his notes. And I put him side by side with the man he's always paired with in history. His name is Henry Stanley. Now let me tell you a quick story. David Livingstone went into the Congo region in the early 1860s. After that, he disappeared. Nobody heard from him. He hadn't literally disappeared, but the British media especially took this story and said he went into the dark continent, and we haven't heard from him in years. And it became an international story. The whole world talked about what happened to David Livingstone. So, Henry Stanley, let me tell you about him. Nope. I'll tell you more about him later. But Henry Stanley, he's a reporter based in New York City, and he's a young reporter looking for a great story. So he decides he's going to go find David Livingstone and solve the mystery. And long story short, because it's actually a very, very long story in one of my favorite books of all time called Into Africa, which I'll buy for somebody if they want to read. Just let me know. Send me a message on Edmodo, and I'll make it a class book. But anyways, he goes into Africa to find Dr. David Livingstone, and he does, successfully. They have this famous encounter. People assume he's dead, but Henry Stanley finds him and says these famous words, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. And it's been years, and members of his team have died, and he's marched miles and miles and miles through the thick jungle, and he finally finds Dr. Livingstone. And he reports back to the world that he's alive. But, bigger picture, he also mapped out the Congo region. So Henry Stanley traces the course of the Congo River. King Leopold II, which is where we get into our imperialist study, of Belgium, hires him to help obtain lands in the Congo. Leo lies to the world. He says, I'll promote trade, eliminate the slave trade, and promote Christianity. But really, let's see what he does. So, to our study, the Congo Free State. The Congo Free State is in Central Africa today. It is the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is what it looks like on the map in 1880. So facts. Private Kingdom of Leopold is established in 1877. He's Belgium. He's from Belgium. What does that make him? Belgish? I can't remember. From 1870 to 1908, he controls the private Kingdom of Congo. This is the scene of exploitation, greed, and mass killings and maimings of those who Leopold rules, or who did not work hard enough as forced laborers in rubber plantations or other profit-making ventures. So that serves as our thesis. Here's King Leopold. Although one of the worst villains in history, he had one of the greatest beards. See how hard he works on that? So how did Leo get the Congo? Well, at first, Leopold moved into the Congo region mainly because of a lack of interest by the other European powers. People didn't know the resources that exist there. By the late 1870s, though, Britain, France, and Germany all began to take a keen interest. Leo founded the African International Association of Explorers, Geographers, and Philanthropists in 1876 to civilize Central Africa. So basically, he hires a team to help him move into the Congo. He's a liar. A couple of things that he does. He makes these diplomatic promises. England will be given the most favorable nation status. France, they'll be given the support of the association that he started, and the National Bank of Stanley Pool will work for them. Germany was told that no nation would get any special status, and German traders would be welcomed, and the U.S. was told that his association, in quotes, would rule Congo until it was ready to be self-governing. So the U.S. was interested in the humanitarian, or so they said, concern there. Remember, the Berlin Conference, 1884, 14 nations met in Berlin, and some highlights: France got 257,000 square miles of the North Bank. Portugal got 351,000 square miles of modern Angola, and King Leopold personally gained 905,000 square miles, which became the Congo Free State. So let's take a look at the scramble for Africa real quick. Only coastal ports used by European merchants essentially before the scramble of Africa existed. So take a look. You've got the French Empire with a very small piece of land here. Also, the British Empire only has parts of South Africa at this point and along the western coast. The Spanish Empire, you can hardly find it. It hardly exists. And the Portuguese Empire, from their 1450s, 1500 empire, they still have remains there. The division, competition for land was fierce, and the Berlin Conference took place in 1884 to 1885 to basically clarify the rules as to how Africa would be divided up. Highlights: no African rulers are invited, and they did not take into consideration language or ethnic groups. By 1914, only 2 countries in Africa remained independent: Liberia and Ethiopia. So here's a look. Africa by 1914 looks like this. The British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Belgium, German, and Italian have divided up Africa, and you can see that the British, they gained the most favorable parts of Africa, in addition to Belgium with the Congo. French West Africa, not very lucrative, mainly because this land is all desert. That's mostly the Sahara Desert. So although it looks like France gained a great deal, they didn't gain much in terms of wealth and superiority. Here's King Leopold, and he's yanking his part of Africa as the great European powers begin to claim and divide up in the mad scramble for Africa. I'm going to stop right there and make a second video, so take a break and open up the second video in a second.